Welcome everyone to Raise the Roof. Ideas have consequences, and so today my co-host Leroy Hill and I are joined by Dr. Owen Anderson to offer a biblically sound and philosophically robust discussion of Jean-Jacques Rousseau's book, Discourse on the Origin and Foundations of Inequality Among Men. We'll show how the book, you've probably never read, is behind many of today's headlines and cultural conflicts. Listen to discover how these ideas have shaped the Western worldview and maybe even deformed the worldview of many Christians. But before we dive in, don't forget to follow and rate the show on your favorite podcasting service. And remember, if you want to participate with me in a subscribers-only question and answer, you can sign up through my website, morethancake.org. Let's start with a little bit of housekeeping. Jean-Jacques Rousseau was born in Geneva on June 28, 1712, and his views on the world and life were profoundly shaped by his Protestant background and early family life. His mother passed away shortly after birth, leaving him under the care of his emotionally unstable father, Isaac Rousseau. At the age of 10, his father's quarrelsome nature led him to leave Geneva, and Rousseau was placed under the care of an uncle and then at a boarding school where he experienced more personal trauma, a theme that would haunt him throughout his life. Rousseau's childhood, writes Benjamin Weicker, led him to love romance, dislike labor, and more than anything, despise even the smallest hint of authority that might make him beholden to some master, no matter how mild or reasonable. Rousseau's passions account for his difficulty in holding any position for very long. It was largely because of this loathing of authority that, for the most part, he was self-taught, reading intensely and indiscriminately. As a result, this combined sort of his brilliant and original insights with a lot of embarrassing and harmful blunders. At 16, Rousseau fled Geneva, making the start of a restless period of wandering. He converted to Catholicism after meeting a priest in Savoy. He sought stability through religion and patronage and was introduced to Madame de Warens as an influential figure in his life who nurtured his intellectual development and provided him with both mentorship and romantic companionship. From 1729 to 1738, he lived in Annecy and the Saône, and where he attempted various occupations, including music teaching, though often without success. Rousseau's intellectual curiosity flourished during his time at Les Charnets and a pastoral estate where he found contentment and began his philosophical studies. In 1745, Rousseau entered a relationship with Thérèse Levasseur, a hotel maid, and he callously abandoned their 5 children at a foundling hospital where the children would likely have come to an early death. Rousseau's account of his decision tells us a lot about his philosophy. He says this, quote, "I made up my mind cheerfully without the least scruples, and the only ones I had to overcome were those of Thérèse. When it was time for her to give birth, he chose a discreet and trustworthy midwife. The baby was then deposited at this foundlings hospital in a way that was customary." And he says, "The following year there came a same inconvenience and the same expedience. I didn't reflect any further, and the mother didn't approve any more fully. She groaned, but she obeyed." Now, between 1744 and 1756, Rousseau lived in Paris, working as a secretary to wealthy patrons and trying to make a name as a thinker. In 1754, he returned to Geneva, reclaiming his citizenship and embracing Protestantism again. During this time, he formulated a lot of his ideas on the social contract, education, and personal freedom, which he would later expand in his writings. Rousseau's desire for solitude led him to the Hermitage. It's there he became involved in complicated relationships with the Parisian elites and was alienated from influential figures like Voltaire and Derrida. In 1762, facing persecution for his controversial works, he fled to Switzerland and then to England under the protection of David Hume. However, this relationship soured as Rousseau grew increasingly paranoid and alienated. In his later years, he returned to Paris, living in relative obscurity and poverty while he continued to write and study botany. He passed away on July 2nd, 1778, leaving a legacy as a passionate yet troubled figure who challenged societal norms. So with that background in mind, let me just draw a thumbnail sketch of some of his important works. So Rousseau's literary works profoundly challenged conventional Christian notions of human nature and society, thereby establishing the groundwork for contemporary social and political philosophy, which you'll hear us discuss a lot in today's show. His seminal work, The Discourses on the Sciences and Arts, was a highly acclaimed essay in which he posited that the advancement of civilization inherently leads to the corruption of humanity's goodness. Rousseau asserted that savages are not evil precisely because they lack the knowledge of what it means to be good. Consequently, it is only through the establishment of social institutions that early humans became victims, so to speak, of moral corruption. His radical assertion that society transforms individuals into mere happy slaves profoundly influenced the trajectory of Rousseau's subsequent philosophical musings. His next work, Discourse on Inequality from 1755, is the subject of our discussion today. And it further elaborated this critique by scrutinizing the origins of inequality. Rousseau proposed that private property serves as a catalyst for human suffering and moral decay. As described by Weicker, this work is characterized by profound confusion whose rotting fruit has subsequently spawned numerous generations of erroneous thinking. Rousseau's most significant political work, The Social Contract from 1762, famously begins with this phrase, "Man is born free, and everywhere he is in chains." In his book, Rousseau advocates for a society governed by a general will where individuals can attain true freedom through collective governance and adherence to a shared moral framework. Rousseau's autobiographical work, Confessions, published posthumously, stands as one of the most introspective literary works in Western history. In this unflinching self-examination, Rousseau exposes his innermost thoughts, recounting both personal shortcomings and philosophical revelations. As summarized by Weicker, Rousseau's influence extends to the genesis of Romanticism and folk nationalism, the French Revolution and totalitarianism, Marx and Nietzsche, Freud and Darwin, modern anthropology and Margaret Mead, the sexual revolution and the dissolution of the traditional family structure. All of these phenomena bear the distinctive mark of Rousseau's genius and frequent and sometimes serious errors. So with that introduction to Rousseau and his works, let me bring in Leroy Hill and Owen Anderson. All right, let's dig into the substance of what we're going to talk about. We're looking at Rousseau, and we're looking. I want to start with his big picture of life, and this goes a little bit outside of the book that we're looking at, more to how he approached life and his writings. So how would he answer? And I'm going to combine sort of our first and sixth questions here. How did I come into being, and what happens when I die? And those again that's our inroad question to the ultimate reality of life. So when it comes to those ultimate reality questions, was Rousseau a Christian? Did he believe in God? Was there a biblical framework that guided, do you think, his thinking? What would people get when they read Rousseau? I'll let Owen, you jump in. You're the.
Want me to go first? Okay.
You're the genius. So we'll give it to you.
No, don't. Thanks. I appreciate that, but no. So yeah, I think with Rousseau, you're going to hear about God. You're going to read his book, and God's going to be mentioned. But so he's not overtly an atheist, but he is one of the main instigators. He really is the philosophical foundation for the French Revolution, which was atheistic. And his view of God is pretty hands-off. God is maybe the deistic deity. He doesn't seem to put much influence in scripture beyond human traditions, which he's opposed to. So I think that's part of the difficulty for a younger audience reading Rousseau is those things aren't going to come out clearly in him. Mm-hmm. But he has a way of writing which is very romantic and encourages big ideas and revolutionary change. You can make the world a better place. It's kind of like a self-help speaker of his day. And so that captures a lot of people's attention. You might be pretty far down the road before you realize, oh, wait a minute, this guy's he's at least a deist, maybe actually atheistic.
Yeah. Leroy, is that your take too?
He reminds me a little bit of Hobbes in that, he's not going to come out and thoroughly excoriate Christianity. He sees its utility in organizing society, if you will. So he's not going to come out and excoriate it, but he's also not going to advocate using it as a means to order your life. And I think part of that might be it's very interesting. Part of that might be an internal revolt against organized religion or organized system of organized religion. I mean, that's really what I think he might be arguing against. So he might give a cursory nod toward religious affections, organizing your life in that way, but he's going to reject the church's control or rule over one's life, or even an adherence to Scripture.
Yeah, I think that's right. And one thing to add is it's a great contrast between him and Augustine when you read each of their confessions. Rousseau begins his confession by saying he wants to be able to tell God about himself so that God sees how great Rousseau is. Whereas Augustine, of course, each chapter begins with a humble prayer to God, who's the origin of my being, who's redeemed me from my sin. And so Rousseau's view of himself is very elevated. He doesn't see himself as someone who's a sinner who needs Christ. So even when he talks about religion, it'll just be for what Leroy said, organizational purposes. It won't be because I'm personally a sinner. And so that tells us about the French context also. I mean, we won't get into French history here, but the French context is very different from the German or the English context. The French violently persecuted all of the Protestants, slaughtered them, as in the case of St. Bartholomew's Day massacre. When the Pope heard about that, he rejoiced that they'd waited outside of church to kill women and children Protestant women and children as they came out of church. And so there was really no Protestant influence intellectually by the time of Rousseau in France. And so you just have the philosophes, who are basically atheists, or the corrupt Roman Catholic Church. And those are the options they're dealing with.
It's people. I mean, in our time, where the church is, is only conjectured to be in control of everything, but not really, right? People don't grasp what an effect and what some might conclude as a stifling effect on human freedom that the church exhibited, prior to the Enlightenment, and why the thinkers in that era, like a Hobbes and a Rousseau, would somewhat rail, and even would rail against it, and it's only after you consider that and say then, and you can see that, you can see why these guys might have an issue. So in one sense, it might explains, Rousseau's dalliances with, the morality of Scripture and seeing it, and Hobbes in there, seeing it as an organizing practice, but also, inflame their distinct hatred of any organized religion. So, I mean, that's just very interesting.
Yeah, exactly. And so, England has its own version, but England has nonconformists, separatists. It has the Presbyterians, the Baptists, the Congregationalists, all of whom argued and pushed back against the Church of England. And that's how we get here. All three of us are here because of those guys. What I mean by that is First Amendment, United States, separation of church and state, whereas France never had anything like that. And France particularly was a very dogmatic country, willing to slaughter Protestants just after church service in order to advance the Roman Catholic cause.
So let me do this. Let me ask this. When we talk about Rousseau then in terms of origins and then how did I come into being, I came across, I don't know where I was reading, but sort of like, I think it was actually in Weiker's book, he talks about his reimagined Adam and Eve, right? Who were the ideal humans that first existed? And it seems to me that Rousseau reimagines Adam and Eve as these autonomous, self-interested human beings, very different from a Genesis version of who those ideal first humans were. He wrote this: males and females united fortuitously, depending on encounter, occasion, and desire, and they left each other with the same ease. So there's not this sense for Rousseau that Adam and Eve were created for a purpose, man for woman, for marriage. And this gets later, some of the ethics we get about purpose in life. We'll cover it some deeply, but it just sort of his ideal for man and woman seemed to be this sort of autonomous, random selves that bumped into each other one day and discovered, hey, we can make babies. But then it's sort of like they go about their own life. And I think in some sense, maybe that's Rousseau's loss of his own mother when he was young, troubled relationship with dad. Don't want to get too Freudian here, but it gave him this impression that we begin life in chaos and then live alone, though, right? He says this, quote, he's talking about in these ancient times, the ideal sort of rustic, the humanity before technology and society, which we'll get to a little bit later. But he says this, the mother nursed her children at first for her own need, like she did it out of selfish interest. Then habit, having endeared them to her, she nourished them afterward for their need. As soon as they had strength to seek their food, they did not delay in leaving the mother herself. And as there was practically no other way to find one another again than not to lose sight of each other in the jungle or forest, they were soon at a point of not even recognizing one another. So this sort of sense is like, yeah, we take care of each other for a while, but only because there's this sort of either self-interest or maybe some sense of interest in the other. But then eventually we go upon and live our lives in autonomy. And so I think that his view of humanity, that answer that how do we come into being, and sort of that really ends up shaping his purpose for a lot of what way society functions. What do you guys think on that?
Yeah, Leroy?
Yeah, it's very interesting. And I say it's interesting because when I was reading him, I said, this sounds like a just so story. In other words, this sounds like a story that you tell that is not, evidence-based, but is really to fit the particular narrative that you wish existed. And then as you begin to read Rousseau, you understand that Rousseau is, making a thought experiment, if you will. His whole idea is a thought experiment. In other words, he understands that it isn't really the state of things or the actual state of affairs, but what he's trying to do is imagine the kind of state of affairs in which his ideas of social inequality, to explain it, I should say. So I don't think that he believed, that, deeply. I think this is just his way of making, an argument, because, think about this. Imagine, if his view is real. In other words, that there really isn't, a God out there. Let's just assume that there really isn't a God out there, and that this materialistic and, evolutionary based, world is really what is. Then why aren't people pre-programmed or predetermined to do what they do? And if they are pre-programmed and predetermined to do what they do, what's the problem with the moral dysfunction of society? It's just the way that things really are. I just think that it's a thought experiment. I don't think that he thinks it's real, but I think also that it's a little bit muddled.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that, again, he might reference God, the one who knocked over the first domino. And here's an important relationship, is that that's about all that Aristotle gives us. And the Christian theologians have been relying on Aristotle and not actually getting to biblical theism. And I think you can get to biblical theism not simply by going straight to the Bible, but creation, general revelation, reveals the same God to it. Yahweh is displayed in the works of creation. So the French intellectuals have been ignoring that for some time. So now we get this Rousseau view, and Leroy's 100% right that it's a just so story, because it also shows us how evolutionary thought was already in the atmosphere the couple generations before Darwin. And so you just have to explain human society through only material terms. And so you basically, you have these people who are just barely out of the caves, and they form some agreement to protect themselves, and that's the origin of government. Now, that's very different than God giving a moral law and commanding people to keep that law, and the civil magistrate's job is to protect those who do good and to put fear into those who want to do evil. So he is definitely arguing against Christianity, and that's one of the things where a general reader or a young student may not be alerted to that, right? That he doesn't say at the beginning, and here's why Christianity is false. That he just gets into his view. And so it's useful for the Christian student to know, here's all the points where this contradicts the Bible. One of them is, in the origin story, for him, the world began with suffering in it. Second one is, moral evil or sin is only definable after society is formed. In nature, when you're by yourself in nature, there's no such thing as sin.
Hmm.
So those are two big pieces besides the doctrine of God that are directly contrary to the Christian worldview.
Yeah. Well, and I think what's good about that is you've moved us nicely into sort of at least the next one of our questions. How can I know the purpose for my life? Like, why do I exist? What is my purpose therein? And unlike, say, later the Marxist kind of idea where there's this future utopia, it's for Rousseau, it's the utopia is in this past. And it's like Rio said, it's a narrative, it's a story, it's a fiction, it's not a real time. It's just there's no facts to support it. He just sort of creates this story about an ideal humanity and this noble savage imagery, which builds itself into European culture. It's when people would start to come in and come to the Americas. There was this idea of the noble savage. These people that live there must be these wonderful, morally good and just people. Like, this was the expectation of John Wesley when he came to the Americas, because he had this idea in English culture that these people were going to be the ideal humans because they hadn't been corrupted by civilization. And then they were shocked when they found that they were, doing child sacrifice and they were having the same wars as everybody else did. But that was this ideal of the past. And Weicker, I had this quote from
Well,
this
we still
book
have it with us today, right?
Oh, yeah. No, go
where
ahead.
I work, Arizona State University has that view. It teaches that view that until the Westerners showed up, people were great. People were living this ideal life in the Americas, offering child sacrifices, raping each other. And then the Westerners showed up and started causing problems.
Hmm.
Yeah. Isn't that crazy then too? Like, to think that like Rousseau's idea of this noble savage, so to speak, is really what drives the sort of neo-Marxist critical theory, critical social studies ideal. It's rooted in Rousseau's ideal humanity, his origin story, but then the origin of what our purpose is. And it's get rid of technology, science, modernity, then you have the ideal human. Yeah, Leroy, jump in.
Yep.
Yeah, I mean, that's why I call it a just so story. It's the kind of story that you tell to explain, your issues or your problem with the society we have. I mean, if you look at what is, right, and then you try to extrapolate all the way back, then you have to craft a story at the beginning that can literally say, this is why we kind of got all this. And then think about the critique there. They have to have the noble savage. But I mean, if you just think about the noble savage, even if there are no other people around, the noble savage is going to compete with animals for resources, right? Even if are no other people around. And here's the problem. Let's say that there are a group of different noble savages. Well, one noble savage is going to be a better hunter. I mean, Rousseau acknowledges that one of these noble savages is going to be a better hunter than the rest of the noble savages, which means that he's going to be a better game getter than everyone else, which means that he's going to have more resources, right? So he doesn't.
Wasn't it funny he picked that one though too, rather than a better thinker? He picked hunter because that's what Nimrod was said of Nimrod, right? And he's the one who developed the fallen civilization, the city of man.
Sure. It's madness.
Weicker has a quote. I wanted to get this quote out of the book. I actually thought this chapter of his, they had some really good quotes in there. And I like this one. He says, what then did Rousseau imagine? It's that just so story, right, Leroy? What was his imaginary humanity? He says, if we might be a bit glib, whereas Hobbes's men in the state of nature were gorillas, nasty, brutish, and curiously short, Rousseau's primitive men were suave, peaceful, innocent, carefree, and cheerfully libidinous bonobos. Rousseau therefore gave us a new Adam, a carefree, make love, not war, ancestral archetype who became the societal ideal of the free love movements. And so it's just really, it is a little bit glib, but it's actually pretty darn accurate, I think, to what that image we've been discussing here of this idea of and that set the stage for what our purpose is, right? Our purpose is to become that sort of carefree, sex, drugs, rock and roll kind of mentality. Man, you think about Rousseau and people that have never read him yet, that was an entire culture and today
He's a horrible person.
Yeah.
Just out of reach, I can almost get it, is my copy of Paul Johnson's Intellectuals. And I highly recommend that book. It's chapter by chapter going through intellectuals. And I think Rousseau's the first one, coming down to, I think the last one's Bertrand Russell. And what Paul Johnson does is excellent. It just shows what terrible people each of them was. He says the grander their claims about the world, the worse they were to the actual people in their lives. And so you'll have someone like Bertrand Russell talking about how we got to stop nuclear war, and if we do that, the world will be great. And then he's just a horrible adulterer in his life. And Rousseau's perhaps even worse. I mean, I don't like Bertrand Russell, so I don't want to say someone's worse than him, but Rousseau's even worse. He's having kids, he's dropping off at orphanages, he hasn't raised any of them. So, yeah, there's something to that. I mean, a horrible person can still say true things. So you don't want to commit the genetic fallacy or an ad hominem. However, if what the person's saying is, I have a self-help vision for you to make your life better, and their life's a mess, you'd say, cure yourself, right? Then I'll see about it, right? So when you get a guy telling you want to be fit, you expect him to be 0% body fat, shredded, huge muscles, right? You don't expect someone who's out of shape telling you how to get in shape.
Ooh, I almost had a Biden administration joke for the HHS guy.
That's
Richard Levine, but
I
won't do that. That's too easy.
But we also do. I mean, we don't want to. I don't want to suggest that we sideline Rousseau because of that. But it's a point to come in with. Rousseau's clearly not going to be able to solve his own life's problems. There's also the story when he went to England to visit David Hume, and David Hume was a very nice person, very genial. People liked him. He's friendly. And he ended up within a week, I think, hating Rousseau, and they parted enemies because Rousseau's just such a boorish person. And if you can get David Hume to dislike you, I think that says something. So it wasn't the meeting of the minds that they thought it was going to be because Rousseau's personal morality was so poor. And so that's something to keep in mind. But I think getting into how was this so influential? Well, we're arguing against the French monarchy and the French aristocracy. And an important piece of the Roman Catholic countries was that education was generally confined to just those two groups. And you'd have some professional aristocrats, children would be professionals that might go into law or divinity, but the rest of the population was left without much attempt to educate them. And in the English world, and in Germany, where the Protestant reformers worked, you have at least this concern. We want to teach everyone how to read so they can read the Bible. And that's a universal concern. So that by the time we get to the English colonies in New England, it's the most literate place on earth. Everyone knows how to read because they want to be able to read the Bible. And so Rousseau, in this context, really miserable French circumstances. And let's evaluate his argument. Is his argument going to be what brings about the utopia he wants? I think when we're arguing, when someone's arguing against something bad, we can give them the benefit of the doubt. We can say, oh, good, they saw this abuse. He saw abuses in the French Roman Catholic Church. That's wonderful. But it turns out, I think, that his replacement was arguably even worse, because what his replacement gave us was Napoleon, who brought bloodshed across Europe for a decade and resulted in millions of people either being killed through war or displaced or going through famine. Napoleon was a contender in the English-speaking world for the Antichrist. Of course, the three of us don't think he was, but he was a horrible person. And it was the French Revolution that hoisted an emperor, a dictator, onto the world with all of their high speeches about reason. They gave us a tyrant.
Yeah, that gets us to our third question then. What's the right thing to do? How do we know what moral good and bad is within Rousseau's thinking? And so I think some of the ideas we've covered a little bit here, obviously he saw morality as a social construct. All society is nothing more than really the chains of slavery. So every time there's an advancement, whether it's technology or when new kings come to power, make new laws, all of those are signs of slavery. Because again, the ideal is the noble savage, the person unencumbered by moral constraints that are forced on it by society. And so primitive men and women, they acted only on sexual impulse, right? Weicker again says Rousseau is the father of 19th century randy intellectual rogue. That's just such a great little quote, the randy intellectual rogue. Just fulfill your desires and your passions. Follow your heart kind of thing was Rousseau's idea. Don't let anybody tell you can't become what you want to become. All of those ideas. Now, obviously there's other influencers in those thoughts, but I think of all those phrases and I think, okay, there's a little bit of Rousseau in every one of those. I'll ask this one quote and then you guys can jump in on this. It says, everyone peaceably waits for the impulsion of nature, yields to it without choice, with more pleasure than frenzy, and the need satisfied, all desire is extinguished, and really and any woman is good for him at that time, right? So everybody has this impulse, this natural desire for sex and to fulfill this. You're just waiting for a way to fulfill it, and it's sort of like any port in the storm. Any woman can satisfy it. It doesn't matter who she is. You don't have to. There's no attraction. There's no love. There's no sense of obligation. It's just find the person who will fit the need, satisfy the desire in the moment, and then you're done. And then you move on to the next thing.
Yeah,
wow, that's crazy.
I think that Rousseau doesn't have an issue with the kind of natural moral problems that arise. I think Rousseau roots all the problems in civilization. So while Rousseau might he might come out and say whatever about what kind of morality or how we ought to live, and he does this in some of his other works. He's not really going to have. That's not really where his critique is rooted. His critique is really rooted in the problems that he believes are unnatural, those that arise from civilization. So if his critique is toward that civilization is really wrong, he doesn't really have a natural critique. He has a more of a political critique, because for Rousseau, the very fact that these problems arise because of civilization, they're artificial, foisted upon man, and therefore are the real root of the problem, because civilization brings about inauthentic and unnatural and artificial issues that man in his own unique state of nature would never have to deal with. So for Rousseau, he can take his 5 kids and drop them off at the orphanage and never have it afflict his conscience, because he says this is just what it is. If somebody else will take care of them, then so be it. But he never connects the fact that the existence of that orphanage, right, exists because of men's proclivities and moralities that they forced on society. So
the Roman Catholic, they're Christian orphanages.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, one thing to add, though, we've been going down the track of the Rousseau's state of nature man, and as what you've been saying is correct, but he also has the common good man, which is what was influential on the French Revolution. So we should look at that as well, because there's a direct line from that to Marx. And the idea for the general will in Rousseau is not simply that you add up all the individual wills. The general will is opposed to the individual will. It's not the summary of the individual wills. The general will is the will for what is the common good of the society, culture, group you're in. Mm-hmm. And so to have that will, you are saying, my private will be subjected to that general will. What's good for me is I can pay my mortgage and rent a car or own a car to get to work to pay my mortgage again. But what's good for the general will is that my money's confiscated to be used by for the government's purposes, and the government represents that general will. And so you'll hear this still. I'll see Christians, they're particularly Christians who are on the left, talk about the common good. And that's a great term if you don't know what it means. Sounds wonderful, but this is the origin of that kind of talk. Yeah. It's the common good against the individual. And I think if we correctly define what is good, I'm going to take the Westminster Shorter Catechism, question 1. Our chief end, which is the same as what is good, is to glorify God and enjoy him forever. And if that's our highest good, there's no conflict between the individual will and the collective will. Both of them have the same good. Whereas in Rousseau's model, there's a conflict that still comes down to us in the present, that you heard in this last election.
Mm-hmm.
It hasn't been finished yet, in the sense that the other side that just lost is not saying, hey, maybe we're wrong. They're regrouping to do it again. And so this is a deep conflict still within the West. And this is the view, Rousseau's view is the one that won at the university between 1960 and the present. Before that, Locke, who represents the other side, was the more dominant one.
I like what you have to say there, because that Marxist sort of inspire, the part of him that inspired the Marxist strain, even though there's differences, obviously, how I think it's modified. I think that's really critical to seeing where we are today and understanding this conflict. And you brought up some really good points. Let me start with this quote, though, so people can see where this is tied in Rousseau. And then I think there's a really interesting application. I want to see what you guys think. So Rousseau says this: all ran to meet their chains to those that thinking they secured their freedom. That is, every human built the societal structures around them, thinking that this was the guarantee of liberty, right? When you have a structured society, but they're giving up the past, this noble past, right? He says, such was the origin of society and laws, which gave new fetters to the weak and new forces to the rich, destroyed natural freedom for all time, established forever the law of property and inequality, changed a clever usurpian into an irrevocable right, and for the profit of a few ambitious men, henceforth subjugated to the whole human race to work, servitude, and misery. And so we see there the evils of capitalist, of property, of ownership, and all of these things. But something in you that you said, Owen, really struck me as super relevant. I read a tweet by the now former, he's the retired president of World Vision. I was going to pull it up and I don't have it accessible right in front of me. But one of the things he said was after, and it was his election analysis, was that the people that are voting because the price of eggs are too high or that they can't afford to pay rent, you are not voting a Christian worldview thinking. He said, we are supposed to vote for the poor, vote for the least of these. And my response was like, wait a second. Well, if you can't afford your groceries, doesn't that make you the poor? If you're the person being trafficked across the southern border, aren't those the most vulnerable that we're supposed to support? And of course, didn't answer because I'm, what are you saying? I mean, you're supposed to be a guy at World Vision about the poor, the people that can't afford groceries, helping them. But when you were talking, it really struck me. And I knew this was kind of the case, but it just really brought some clarity there. He's really parroting this sort of Rousseauian, sort of Marxist idea, saying that you're voting for your own need for property, for stuff, but that's not what the ideal of humanity is. That's not what is morally good. So when he's saying help the poor, what he means by that is not what you or I would mean. He doesn't mean actual people without money or without resources. He's talking about the people that are trapped in this societal, illusion that if I own a house, that I am free. That's actually
he also doesn't mean
change,
poor in spirit.
Right?
He doesn't mean share the gospel with the poor in spirit. He means he's only reading the Bible economically, and he'll confuse Christians, unfortunately, because they'll see him quote the Bible and they'll say, "Yeah, I guess Jesus was a Marxist who wanted us to take from those who have to give to the poor." But I want to hear from Leroy about this because it sounds just like what I've been hearing since the election. Now, not that I watch The View a lot, but when I see clips from The View or CNN or MSNBC, they're saying the problem was that racist black voters were duped by Trump. And I'm hoping they go with that story for another 10 plus years because they'll never win again.
Me too. It is, it's the intersectionality of the poor, right? That's the method here. I mean, who are the poor and what makes them poor and who determines that they're poor and what is the common good and what do you mean by the common good and who gets to determine what's the common good? And once you remove a biblical ethic, biblical worldview from the whole equation, it's up for grabs. It's who's got the loudest voice, who's got the biggest megaphone, who's got the most influence. And I've said this a million times, and this goes all the way back to the 1920s. Black people were all, most people don't realize that they were all Republicans up until the mid 30s. It was in the mid 30s that Black people began to shift away from the Republican Party. And what was the reason? Economics. I mean, the Depression was still full in swing, and they were suffering. And the Democrats, offered them an off ramp. Now think about it. In the 1930s, in his book, The Lynching Tree, boy, I got that guy's face right.
James Cone.
James Cone is recording how Black leaders are writing the president about stopping this lynching. So think about it. When America was most racist against Blacks in the 1930s, meaning the Democrats were most racist against Black people began to vote Democrat, so that by 1965, 92% of Black people voted Democrat. Now, here's why all that matters. You would think that they're calling Donald Trump Hitler and a fascist and everything in the entire world. And what people are not realizing is that they've had 4 years to live under, his economic policies. And that trumped all of the nonsense that they were saying, because they had this reality of when this guy was president, his policies led to more prosperity. And this notion of all the people who are, arrayed against, those people are telling them what their good is. Your good is what we say it is. It's what we say it is.
And that's how Rousseau defines a general will.
Exactly.
The general will becomes this thing where the ones who represent the general will can tell you, the individual, what's good for you.
Mm-hmm. It's the intelligentsia. It's the smarties. It's the people who, the so-called elite, if you will. They're the ones who get to determine what the common good is. Not me, not my pockets, not watching my kids have something to eat, not me caring about their future. I mean, it's amazing, right? Because this is kind of repeating history. And here's the thing. Black men saw that as a siren song. If we listen to you, we're going to crash our ships on the rocks. And not only did Black men hear that, Latino men and women heard that if we listen to you people are going to crash our ships on the rocks. We are not listening to you. What we want is what we think is our individual good. And we think that our individual good, if we're good and we're working hard and taking care of our families, that will ultimately lead, to the common good, because we'll have strong, healthy families. Whereas these other folks, what are they saying? They're saying, we need child mutilation, more child sacrifice, more destruction of the family. It's the most insane argument that any person could ever make, and think that people are going to vote for it. It's the dumbest thing in the world. But I'm glad, though.
Yeah,
but like you, I hope that they continue.
Yeah, I know, because it's dehumanizing. They think that they're being so, politically correct, and they're concerned about minorities, and then they dehumanize them by saying they didn't vote because they can think and they had a good argument. They only voted because they're easily tricked, and so it's what you just see so often, that the very people speaking out against racism are the most racist ones in the room. But one more point for me is that for those watching, and if either of you haven't read this book, The Closing of the American Mind by Alan Bloom. So that's like 50 years old now, I think 87. But it's the better book compared to the more recent similar book by Carl Trueman. Carl Trueman ends up arguing, he argues against Rousseau, that especially the Rousseau you're talking about, Joe, at the beginning, but he ends up adopting the Rousseau view of the common good. And he argues against individualism, which is what John Locke did. Whereas in The Closing of the American Mind, which is, as I said, the better of the two, I highly recommend it. It's 50 years old, so you're not going to get it down to the present, but you could continue it to the present. You see an argument between Locke and Rousseau in the past 250 years. And you'll understand the American intellectuals, even in our day, if you read that book, because you see, yeah, there are these collectivists. They don't believe the individual is smart enough to make their own choices unless the individual goes through government schools and is approved by the government professors. But the individual is not smart enough and needs to be organized, versus the view of John Locke, which is then instantiated in our Declaration of Independence, that no, you have a right to control your life and do what you think is best for yourself. And that might be that you want a family or you don't. You might want to work in this job or that. But the truth is that there's going to be different outcomes because of that, because people have different values and different dreams for their life. And so you can't just look at outcomes and say, well, these outcomes prove systematic racism. No, they might just prove systematic free will.
Exactly. You know, that reminds me of W.E.B. Du Bois wrote, you know, and he was kind of echoing Booker T. Washington, where he wanted a so-called Black intelligentsia who would model excellence and success for Blacks. And we largely got that. But the problem is that these persons, I call them the Afrostocracy, they don't model excellence for Blacks. They model victimhood. They model tilting the system in your direction. They don't model hard work. They don't model excellence. They themselves have been educated in the system, the governmental systems, and have gone through the best schools, and have had success in their lives, right? But for everyone else, you're too stupid, to follow the same path that I did too. And not only are you too stupid, if your ideas are different than ours, since we're the Afrostocracy, we're the intelligentsia, then you need to be shouted down. You are evil. You are leading people astray. And for lack of a better way of saying it, that's how we get a Kamala Harris. That's precisely how we get Kamala Harris.
And Joe, you just got the clip of the whole video. What Leroy said, pull that out to advertise it. Can I use that term, Leroy? Afrostocracy?
Oh, Afrostocracy. I'm working on a Substack on this very topic. So yeah,
I'm going to quote you. I'm going to cite you. Then I'm not going to steal it. I'm going to cite you because it's brilliant, and you just nailed it. And I think that was the perfect selection. What Leroy just said from our whole conversation. So once you get that Substack, shoot it to me. Make sure I see it.
I will.
But yeah, one last point, guys. I gotta run to my next meeting. But of course, you guys can keep going. The problem Leroy touched on a little bit. Rousseau is all about this. Why is there suffering? So Christians understand the curse entered in Genesis 3 after sin as a call to repent of sin. And God uses that throughout the scriptures, old age, sickness, death, and then they get intensified into famine, war, and plague. And Rousseau's concern is, how do I avoid that suffering? Government's purpose is to avoid suffering. Now that's different than Romans 13. For Romans 13, it's moral good and moral evil. But now humans don't develop the government for that purpose. They develop it to help them survive better, to live longer, to have more food, to avoid hunger. And so within that Rousseauian system, coming down through Marx to the intellectuals of today, that's their concern also. Me or my group or my people are suffering in some way compared to another group. And so it promotes envy and coveting, and therefore hatred of your neighbor. And so at ASU, where I'm a professor, we have this student training that teaches about the evils of whiteness. Now, if you're a student sitting next to another student and your professor says your life is hard because of people like that, well, that's going to make you hate the guy next to you, naturally would, and breed this kind of division between people. And so that's also why you don't see any kind of unifying message in the Rousseau stream. It ends up in these horrible wars in the 20th century between Marxists and between the Marxists and the West. There's no vision. There's no solution to natural evil. Whereas a Christian solution to natural evil is, hey, that's not your biggest problem. You got a way bigger problem. You're alienated from God. And thankfully, God's calling you to think about that problem. Yeah. You should repent.
Yeah, I think what this last bit of our conversation really got into our last two worldview questions, just to kind of frame this for folks who track on with those worldview concepts. Really, how can I fulfill my purpose? How will my life be judged? How can I fulfill the reason for my existence? what are other going to people? What measuring stick will people use to say I'm good or bad? And that's really what you've both been dialoguing here the last few minutes about. It's that tribalist identity that's going to shape how we're seen. My individuality is lost in the group.
Leroy,
yeah, go for
it. The intelligentsia you mentioned, when I read their biographies about what they suffered, it's sort of like, wait, that was your hardship in life?
Exactly.
Because there are real hardships in life due to race. But what you dealt with was a third grade teacher. You think maybe your third grade teacher didn't like you, but you don't have any verbal proof. You just suspected they didn't like you. That's it?
Yeah. And it's madness. And I was going to say, I think I heard it from Delano Squires and Jason Whitlock. I think they've mentioned it. I don't think either. I think Delano may have gone a little bit of a ways in describing it. And when I think of those people, I think of the intellectual elites, the politicians, the athletes, some of the pastors that fall into those categories. And I think I've coined my own phrase, though. I call it blacktivism, because that's exactly what it is. It's blacktivism. It is an activism that is oriented supposedly in the betterment of Black people, but it really isn't. It's in the successful lining of our own pockets.
And Joe, I'm really sorry I cut you off, Joe. I apologize.
No. That's fine, because I just wanted to frame that, because I feel like we've addressed those, and I do think we need to wrap up here. We're kind of at our time, so I just wanted to get like a final thought, like either one, where do you see, we've kind of discussed where you see it in the culture, but where's the gospel opportunity here? What should Christians be the takeaway? And Owen, I'll let you go first, and then if you have to bounce, that's cool. And then Leroy, I'll finish up with our final thoughts here. But what's the gospel opportunity in the midst of understanding somebody like Rousseau? Where does that seat us in the culture, and how can we make room for Jesus amidst the chaos?
Yeah, it's a great question, because I think there's something attractive clearly about Rousseau. He's done very well for himself. The young person's born into a world that is broken, and they can hardly even understand the many, many ways it's broken. And they're in their early adulthood, 18-ish to 25, they want to fix it and make it better. And so, okay, those are good intuitions to have, but then their diagnosis of the problem is the same as everyone else, and their solution to the problem is the same as everyone else. It has to do with personal or group suffering due to the curse, and that a government will solve that problem. So I mentioned Nimrod earlier. This goes back to Nimrod. He's going to take away hunger. He's a great hunter. He's going to build walls that protect you. He'll provide you with safety, food, and a religion that you need. And that still comes down to the present day. So the opportunity is to say, hey, even in Babylon at its best, you're still alienated from God. That's your deepest problem. You could have all the wealth in the world. You could be reclining on your sofa with all the lords, all the best people. You got your cup that you took from a conquered temple in Jerusalem, and you're toasting each other. But then God shows up. What are you going to say to God? What's your solution to God? And Rousseau's answer was, I'm going to explain to God how to do things. God, scoot over. You know what you're talking about? I do. Let me show you what's done. And Rousseau's life ended in that alienation from God. But you, the student, have an opportunity to fix it. It's a deeper problem. If you don't fix that, you won't fix any of these other ones. And the proof of that is generation after generation of humans trying and failing. You shouldn't think you'll be any different. On the other hand, if you solve that problem, you're restored to God through the redemptive work of Christ. These other problems all also get solved. And so that's, I think, where our opportunity comes in.
Yeah.
I want to thank you guys for having me here.
Thank you, brother. Yeah, it's been good. I appreciate it, man. I'm glad you could join us. Leroy, what do you got for us? What's the gospel opportunity you see here for us?
It's the same thing that when we looked at critical race theory, and we looked at their criticism of society and concluded that they're not chasing ghosts. I mean, they recognize that there's a problem. And in the same way, Rousseau's critique of society and civilization is a good critique. I mean, he's not chasing ghosts. I mean, there are some problems that are inherent within society. And one of the things that I've been spending a lot of time thinking about is how these problems that are working in the background, consistently working in the background to conform us into its own image. To be the kind of people who don't who think that let me put it this way: conform us to a more reductionist view of the world. And this reductionist view excises God from public life, excises God from the reality in our own lives, and says that we have all that we need. I have the cup from the Jerusalem temple. I am, eating, merrily. I am, satisfying my own desires and my societal pursuits. But the very things that make life meaningful and life necessary and actually lead to human flourishing, these are things that are cut away. So I would say, in one sense, Rousseau's critique of civilization, that it is not an unqualified good, is a true critique. Now, as Owen might argue, that means that we Christians, who have the truth, need to think about these things that are missing and then articulate them societally so that people can see that this need in the reality of God is, that we really need God in society. We really need God in our everyday life. We need God, more than a figurehead, but we need God in our very real relationships, so that we are rightly related to things and rightly related to each other, and ultimately leads to the kind of human flourishing that these philosophers promise but can never provide.
Mm. Yeah, I think for the gospel opportunity that I see that's so important out of a guy like Rousseau, and it kind of goes back to something you brought up at the beginning. He's telling a just so story. But think about this. It shows you the power of a narrative, the power of story to transform a society. Here's a guy who wrote hundreds of years ago, and yet he shaped so much of our storytelling, the way we see ourselves, the way we see one another, the way we see the purpose of government and civilization. That's a powerful narrative that he was able to weave. So our opportunity for the Christian is that we've got to master the biblical story, God's narrative, the story that he has shaped for us from Genesis through Revelation. And we've got to be able to tell that story. That's where the concept of worldview can help us, because we can see it holistically. And a lot of people know the Bible verses or know passages, but we can't tell the story. And what we have to get really good at is telling the story of how God created, how he made us in his image, the fall, his promise, his covenant that brought restoration and hope. And what is that future that we're going to encounter? And until we can tell that whole story, people are going to miss the forest for the trees, right? We're going to be stuck on the apologetic issues of what about this problem of evil and this problem of that, and this problem of that. And those are important conversations, but you can't answer all the specifics if they don't know the big picture. And so we need to be good storytellers, better storytellers, our pastors, our teachers, we all, just people hanging out with our kids, with our work colleagues, whatever they are. I think if we can master the story of God, then we'll have not just a powerful story, but a true story. And that has way more power to transform. And it can make a radical shift. We can make a huge shift very quickly in our culture. Think of how the story changed from even one election cycle in just a political sense, right? And if that story can change in politics, and politics is fleeting, how much more could it radically there be a true transformation, a revival for God if we are good storytellers of the gospel. So that's kind of my big thinking takeaway. So any last word on you, man? I'll let you give last word.
I think that you've nailed it. I mean, think about it. Rousseau told a story, and it's like I think Owen said earlier, that evolution, the ideas were already germinating. They were already, in the ether, if you will. And Rousseau, articulated a vision that people who wanted to be untethered from God could grab a hold of. But the thing that you just said, or at least what you just discussed, is that the biblical story is more primal, and it's better. And it isn't just those story. It better articulates the world, the reason why the world really is, and it can articulate the hope that the world might have. Should we all come to grips with it? So I think that's a prescient point that you raised there, Dr. Miller.
Oh, well, thank you, brother. There's a lot more to say about Rousseau's philosophy and how his ideas have shaped our view of moral duty, love, and community. But for now, go out and raise the roof, and I hope you'll come back and join me for the next episode. In the meantime, don't forget to follow and rate the show on your favorite podcasting service. And if you want to participate with me in a subscribers-only question and answer, you can sign up through my website, morethancake.org.